let me start by thanking my colleague from Maryland for her leadership on the Appropriations Committee and her leadership on this difficult issue. She said something in caucus the other day that really struck me. She said, every senator has an opinion on this, but not every senator has the facts. And facts matter, Mr. President. They make for good policy. Last week, I had the opportunity, along with Secretary Johnson, to visit a temporary facility for refugee mothers and their children that's in my home state of New Mexico. The holding area at this facility in Artesia, New Mexico, is one of several ways that DHS is increasing its capacity to process the increasing number of families with children from Central America that are crossing our southwest border. On Monday, 40 individuals were repatriated back to Honduras. And it's reported that more mothers and their children will be sent back to their countries of origin. Now, while I was at this facility, I saw firsthand the remarkable interagency effort that it took to take a federal law enforcement training center, a campus, and turn it into a safe and humane place for families to stay while their cases are being processed. But that's not all I saw while I was there. I watched a young boy play soccer with his little brother, both of them clearly happy to be in the kind of secure environment where they could just be kids. And I saw a lot of mothers. I saw mothers whose faces were worried and who reflected the clear concern for what is the future for them and for their children. What I didn't see at that facility, Mr. President, I didn't see cartel mules. I didn't see drug runners. I didn't see criminals or gang members. These were mothers and little kids. Most of these families come from one of the most violent regions in the world today. And this current crisis is of grave concern to all of us. I know I've heard from a number of my constituents who want to know what they can do to help. And I have to give great credit to the local Chamber of Commerce in Artesia, New Mexico, as they worked very hard as they received hundreds of donations from compassionate New Mexicans across the state, hoping to make a difference in these people's lives. And they understand that this is first a humanitarian crisis. They also understand that we're a nation of laws, but that our immigration system has been broken for a long time and needs to be fixed. The Senate worked for months to address this, but the Republican-led House of Representatives refuses to even debate immigration reform, much less allow a vote on it. Instead, Republicans claim that the president's immigration policies, including deferred action for childhood arrivals, or DACA as it's known, caused a crisis at the border. Mr. President, that couldn't be further from the truth. The increase in unaccompanied children started before President Obama created the DACA program 2 years ago. The United Nations High Commission on Refugees has documented an increased number of asylum seekers from El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala since 2009, a full 5 years ago now. What's more, children crossing the border would not be eligible for DACA. In fact, they wouldn't be eligible for the Senate version of immigration reform. And these asylum seekers are not only fleeing to the United States, but also to the other neighboring countries in the region. They're fleeing to Panama and Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Belize. In fact, those countries saw a 712% spike in asylum cases from El Salvador, from Honduras, and Guatemala from 2008 to 2013, further demonstrating that children are not coming to the U.S. to apply for DACA. They're coming because their lives are at risk back home. In interviews with over 400 children, the United Nations High Commission on Refugees found that no less than 58% of them were forcibly displaced because they suffered or faced harms that indicated a potential or actual need for international protection, an increase of more than 400% from back in 2006. Less than 1% of these kids spoke of immigration reform or some new program or policy as the basis for coming to the United States. In fact, out of the 404 children who were interviewed, there were only four children who expressed a reason for coming that related to some part of the U.S. immigration system. The reality is, as we heard from Senator Mikulski, what's driving our children to our borders is unimaginable violence, is corruption, is extreme poverty, and instability in their home countries. Mr. President, this picture was taken in Tegucigalpa in Honduras and is, frankly, an all too common sight in Honduras today. Not only is the poverty unimaginable, but the violence that we have seen is like nothing in recent history. Honduras has now the world's highest murder rate, with over 90 murders per 100,000 persons annually. Last year, approximately 1,000 young people under the age of 23 in Honduras were murdered out of a nation of only 8 million, 1,000 young people. And a report published by the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops found that 93% of crimes perpetuated against youth in Honduras go unpunished, completely unpunished. The National Observatory for Violence reported that violent deaths of women increased by 246% between 2005 and 2012. Mr. President, this is all the more unsettling to me because I know firsthand that Honduras didn't always look this way. In the 1990s, I traveled to Honduras with my wife, Julie. We were on our honeymoon. We flew into San Pedro Sula. The only time I felt any fear was trying to drive in a city that moves a lot faster than I do when I try to drive on country roads in New Mexico. But we never had any fear for violence while we were in Honduras. We traveled around the country. We went to many places off the beaten path. That's very different today. Today, San Pedro Sula is a city synonymous with murder. And to understand just how bad it is, you can look at pictures like this one of literally body bags getting ready to go to mass graves from murders happening in these neighborhoods in San Pedro Sula. You can read a recent article in the New York Times by Francis Robles. It tells the chilling story of Cristian, an 11-year-old sixth grader from Honduras, who lost his father in March after he was robbed and murdered by gangs while working as a security guard protecting a pastry truck. It's kind of hard to imagine needing a security guard to protect a pastry truck. 3 people he knows were murdered this year alone. 4 others were gunned down on a nearby corner in the span of 2 weeks at the beginning of the year. A girl his age resisted being robbed of the sum of $5. She was clubbed over the head, dragged off by 2 men who cut a hole in her throat and stuffed her underwear in it, and left her body in a ravine across the street from Cristian's house. Not to mention the story of Anthony, a 13-year-old from Honduras who disappeared from his gang-ridden neighborhood. His younger brother, Kenneth, hopped on his green bike to search for him, starting his hunt at what was a notorious gang hangout in the neighborhood. They were found within days of each other, both dead. Anthony, 13, and a friend had been shot in the head. Kenneth, age 7, had been tortured and beaten with sticks and rocks. They were among 7 children murdered in the La Pradera neighborhood of San Pedro Sula in April alone, in 1 month. El Salvador and Guatemala have the world's 4th and 5th highest murder rate today. The Center for Gender and Refugee Studies found that in 2011, El Salvador had the highest rate of gender-motivated killing of women in the entire world. And in Guatemala, the Department of State reports widespread human rights problems, including institutional corruption, particularly in the police and judicial sectors, kidnapping, drug trafficking, extortion, and often lethal violence against women. We have a human crisis at our southern border that requires immediate but compassionate response. Yet instead of supporting the supplemental, which seeks to address the root causes of the crisis and protects these vulnerable children, Republicans are trying to use the crisis to promote fear and their border enforcement only agenda. Recently, a Republican governor suggested the president send the National Guard to, quote, secure the border once and for all, and that the border between the U.S. and Mexico is less secure today than at any time in the recent past. As I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, Mr. President, facts are stubborn things, and this is simply not the case. In fact, the notion that lax border policies are somehow responsible for this latest crisis is not just a myth, it's a willful misrepresentation driven by politicians who would rather create a political issue than to solve a very real problem. The border today is more secure than it has ever been. There are more Border Patrol agents on the ground. There are more resources. There is more technology deployed on the border than at any time in our nation's history, at any time. In fiscal year 2012, the federal government spent almost $18 billion with a B, $17.9 billion on immigration enforcement. Now, that's $3.5 billion more than the budgets of all the other federal law enforcement agencies combined. $3.5 billion more than the FBI's budget, plus the DEA's budget, plus ATF's budget, plus the Secret Service, plus the U.S. Marshal Service. And these resources have made a difference. From fiscal year 2009 to 2012, the Department of Homeland Security seized 71% more currency, 39% more narcotics, 189% more weapons along the southwest border as compared to the last 4 years of the Bush administration. But then it's important to remember that this crisis from refugees in Central America isn't about children and families sneaking across our border like criminals. As you heard from the senator from Maryland, many of these refugees seek out the first Border Patrol agent that they can find in order to turn themselves in. Many of these children have walked across the border or across the Rio Grande with identification literally safety pinned to their shirts. But that image doesn't serve the political interests of those who prefer a border crisis to a refugee crisis. Now let's step back and remember that the Senate passed a comprehensive immigration bill more than a year ago now. A bill that included incredibly important provisions to further strengthen our border, but that would also protect refugee children and crack down on the smugglers and the transnational criminal organizations that are at the root of the current crisis. Notably, this bill was widely supported by both Democrats and Republicans in the Senate chamber. Public support and good economics have not been enough to convince House Republican leaders to hold a vote on immigration reform. But they can't turn a blind eye to the current humanitarian crisis along our nation's southern border. Instead of attacking the president, Senate Republicans should work with him to address the issue, and they should demand that their colleagues in the House act to fix our broken immigration system. Additionally, passing the $3.7 billion supplemental sends a clear signal that we are aggressively stemming the flow of children and families from Central America, while continuing to treat these refugee children humanely and as required under the law. This situation is an emergency, and Mr. President, we need emergency funding. Our immigrant communities have helped to write the economic, social, and cultural history of America. I know this firsthand. My own father is an immigrant who came to this country as a boy from Nazi Germany in the 1930s. And as a nation, we value the twin promises of both freedom and opportunity. Those ideals are important no matter where you're born. But the fact is, our immigration system is broken. Those of us who represent border communities understand the challenge that we face, but there are solutions. Solutions before us that are pragmatic and bipartisan and uphold our American values. I'm familiar with the promise America represents for families. I know how hard immigrants work, how much they believe in this country, and how much they're willing to give back to this country. A small group of faith leaders from New Mexico penned an op-ed in the Albuquerque Journal over the weekend. And in sharing their thoughts on this humanitarian crisis, they wrote, "While the current situation raises the issues in powerful ways, expressing hatred toward, fear of, or anger with women and children serves nothing to resolve national debate. Rather, it engenders a destructive spirit of mistrust. Let us seek to understand the immigrants' reasons for coming and to work collaboratively for just and reasonable immigration reform." End of quote. I could not agree more with these faith leaders. It's time, Mr. President, to fix our broken immigration system once and for all. Our short-term solution is to approve the President's emergency supplemental request now. And as part of our long-term solution, we need House Republicans to put the Senate's immigration reform bill, on the floor for a vote. Our nation, Mr. President, will be the better for it.